historical, philosophical, theoretical, and legal foundations of special and inclusive education. Era of extermination. During the Greek and Roman era, the people held such negative views about disability that it was regarded as a punishment from God, something that signifies being bad or evil. Coupled with the need for military superiority, individuals with disability were labeled as defectives that need to be eliminated from the society. Thus, it was not surprising that there were calls for infanticide or that a father had the right to terminate their child's life if he or she happened to be born with a disability. Era of ridicule. During the Middle Ages, people lived in rigid caste systems that discrimination of individuals who were different from the majority of the society became apparent. Persons with disability were treated with ridicule, in which they were used as servants or fools. They were used as clowns. They were mocked for their deformities and behavior, or may even be ordered to be put to death. Era of asylum. During the Renaissance period, the Catholic Church began accepting persons with disabilities as wards of state. This was the start of the humane treatment given to them. They were taken cared for, albeit in isolation. However, the belief that once disabled, always disabled rendered their individuals as uneducable. Perspectives on educability in the early beginnings of special education. So groups of deaf people have used sign languages throughout history. One of the earliest written records of a sign language is from the 5th century BC in Plato's Cratylus, where Socrates says, "If we hadn't a voice or a tongue and wanted to express things to one another, wouldn't we try to make signs by moving our hands, hand, and the rest of our body, just as dumb people do at present?" Until the 19th century, most of what is known about historical sign languages is limited to the manual alphabets, finger spelling systems that were invented to facilitate the transfer of words from a spoken language to a sign language rather than documentation of the language itself. Debate around the monastic sign language developed in the Middle Ages has come to regard it as a gestural system rather than a true sign language. The earliest records of contact between Europeans and indigenous peoples of the Gulf Coast region in what is now Texas and northern Mexico note a fully formed sign language already in the use by the time of the Europeans' arrival there. These records include the accounts of Cabeza de Vaca in 1527 and Coronado in 1541. Pedro Ponce de Leon, the first teacher for the deaf. He was a Spanish Benedictine monk who is often credited as being the first teacher for the deaf. Ponce de Leon established a school for the deaf at the San Salvador Monastery in Oña. His students were almost all children of wealthy aristocrats who could afford private tutoring. His work with deaf children focused on helping them to learn how to speak language audibly. He also instructed children in writing and in simple gestures. A Spanish monk, Pedro Ponce de Leon, developed the first manual alphabet. This alphabet was based in whole or in part on the simple hand gestures used by monks living in silence. Juan Pablo Bonet, a Spanish priest and pioneer of education for the deaf. He was a Spanish priest and a pioneer of education for the deaf. He published the first book on deaf education in 1620 in Madrid. The modern recorded history of sign language began in the 17th century in Spain, in part with Bonnet. In 1620, Juan Pablo Bonet published Reducción de las letras y arte para enseñar y hablar a los mudos, Summary of the Letters and the Art of Teaching Speech to the Mute, in Madrid. The book is considered the first modern treatise of phonetics. Also, it depicts the first documented manual alphabet for the purpose of deaf education. His intent was to further the oral and manual education of deaf people in Spain. In 1620, Juan Pablo Bonet published Reducción de las letras y arte para enseñar a hablar a los mudos, Redaction of Letters and Art for Teaching Mute People to Speak, in Madrid. It is considered the first modern treatise of sign language phonetics, setting out a method of oral education for deaf people and a manual alphabet. Source Michel de Lippe, father of the deaf. He was a philanthropic educator of 18th century France who has become known as the father of the deaf. De Lippe then turned his attention toward charitable services for the poor, and on one foray into the slums of Paris, he had a chance to encounter with two young deaf sisters who communicated using a sign language. Lippe decided to dedicate himself to the education and salvation of the deaf, and in 1760 he founded a school. In line with emerging philosophical thought of the time, De Lippe came to believe that deaf people were capable of language and concluded that they should be able to receive the sacraments and thus avoid going to hell. He began to develop a system of instruction of the French language and religion. In the early 1760s, his shelter became the world's first free school for the deaf, open to the public, Institut National des Jeunes Sourds de Paris, or the National Institute for Deaf Children of Paris. National Institute for Deaf Youth in Paris, a French free education institute specializing in the education of deaf youth. It is the first school dedicated to teaching young deaf people in the world. Lauren Clerk, the apostle of the deaf in America. Renowned deaf person in American deaf history, when he was 1 year old, Clark fell from a chair into a fire, suffering a severe burn and obtained a permanent scar on the right side of his cheek. Clark's family believed his deafness and inability to smell were caused by this accident. But Clark later wrote that he was not certain of this and might have been born deaf and without the ability to smell. Clark attended Institut National des Jeunes Sourds de Paris when he was just 12 years old and soon became a teacher there. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, he co-founded the first school for the deaf in North America, the Asylum for the Education and Instruction of the Deaf and Dumb, later named American School for the Deaf. Borges household middle class. When he was 1 year old, Clark fell from a chair into a fire, suffering a severe burn, and obtained a permanent scar on the right side of his cheek. Clark families believe his deafness and inability to smell were caused by this accident, but Clark later wrote that he was not certain of this and might have been born deaf and without the ability to smell. The facial scar later provided the basis for his name sign, performed with a manual alphabet for U, a stroke twice downward on the right cheek. Clark attended Institut National des Jeunes Sourds de Paris when he was 12 years old and soon became a teacher there. While there, he was taught by Abbe Sicard and Jean Massieu, who was deaf. In 1815, he traveled with Sicard and Massieu to England to give a lecture and happened upon Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, who was traveling in search of means for instructing deaf children. Gallaudet was invited to visit the school in Paris. Then in 1816, after a few months with Clark at the school, Gallaudet invited Clark to accompany him to the United States. During the trip across the ocean, Clark learned English from Gallaudet, and Gallaudet learned sign language from Clark. Arriving in America, they worked together to establish the first permanent school for the deaf in Hartford, Connecticut, which is now known as the American School for the Deaf. American School for the Deaf, the oldest permanent school for the deaf in the United States and the first school for deaf children anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. It was founded on April 15, 1817 in Hartford, Connecticut by Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, Mason, Cogswell, and Laurent Clerk and became a state-supported school later that year. After being revoked by the Thomas Braidwoods, Gallaudet turned to the Parisian French school teachers of the famous School for the Deaf in Paris, where he successfully recruited Laurent Clerc. Gallaudet was principal until 1830. His son followed in his legacy, establishing Gallaudet University, which followed the ASD's lead and taught its students primarily in American Sign Language, derived from the methodical Signs and Parisian Sign Language of the French Institute for the Deaf. In 2021, the ASD launched its online academy for students ages 12 to 16, which is the first virtual enrollment option offered by the school. The program is intended to provide services to students in other parts of the U.S. as well as international students. It also enrolls homeschooling students and hearing students who want to learn American Sign Language. American School for the Deaf, West Hartford, Connecticut. Gallaudet University is in Washington, D.C. Roch Ambrose Coqueron Sicard, a French abbé and instructor of the deaf. Abbé means ranking Catholic clergy. On the death of the Abbé de Lippe succeeded him at a leading school for the deaf, which de Lippe had founded in Paris. He later met Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet while traveling in England and invited him to visit the school. John Mashu, a pioneering deaf educator. One of six deaf siblings, he was denied schooling until age 13 when he met Abby Sicard, who enrolled him in the Institut National de Waynes Sots de Bordeaux Gradignan, the Bordeaux School for Deaf Children. There he learned to read and write French and later helped develop the first formalized French Sign Language. This French Sign Language was later adapted into American Sign Language. He taught at the famous School for the Deaf in Paris, where Laurent Clerc was one of his students. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. He co-founded the first permanent institution for the education of the deaf in North America, and he became its first principal. When opened on April 15, 1817, it was called the Connecticut Asylum at Hartford for the education and instruction of deaf and dumb persons, but it is now known as the American School for the Deaf. He attended Yale University, earning his bachelor's degree in 1805, graduating at the age of 17 with highest honors, and then earned a master's degree at Yale in 1808. He engaged in many things such as studying law, trade, and theology. In 1814, Gallaudet graduated from Andover Theological Seminary after a 2-year course of study. However, he declined several offers of pastorates due to ongoing concerns about his health. Alice Cagswell, his first student, he was married he married one of his former students named Sophia Fowler, mother of the American deaf, and they had 8 children together. His youngest child, Edward Minor Gallaudet, founded in 1864 the first college for the deaf, which in 1896 became Gallaudet University. Thomas Gallaudet with Alice Cagswell. The Gallaudet Memorial at Gallaudet University. Alice Cogswell was the inspiration to Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet for the creation of the American School for the Deaf. At the age of 2, Cogswell became ill with spotted fever, or also known as the cerebral spinal meningitis. This illness took her hearing, and later she lost her speech as well. Meningitis is acute or chronic inflammation of the protective membranes covering the brain and spinal cord, collectively called the meninges. The most common symptoms are fever, intense headache, vomiting, and neck stiffness, and occasionally photophobia. Mason Fitch Cagswell. He was an American physician who pioneered education for the deaf and also Alice Cagswell's father. Thomas Braidwood. He was a Scottish educator significant in the history of deaf education. He was the founder of Britain's first school for the deaf, instructing the children of the wealthy at his home in the Canongate in Edinburgh. Joseph Pereira. He showed interest in a group of individuals called deaf mutes. He systematically taught them to do simple arithmetic calculations. This was one of the first attempts at demonstrating how individuals with handicaps can be taught through a special education. Valentin Huy. He was the founder in 1785 of the first school for the blind, the Institute for Blind Youth in Paris, or the National Institute for the Young Blind. In 1819, Louis Braille attended this school. The Abbey monks educated Valentin and became a skilled linguist, speaking 10 different languages. He gained the king interpreter to the king Louis XVI. The Abbey monks educated Valentin, and he became a skilled linguist speaking 10 different languages of the day. He also studied ancient Greek and Hebrew. In 1783, he gained the title Interpreter to the King Louis XVI and met a young beggar, Francois Lesueur. He was his first student. He developed a method of phrase letters to teach Lesueur to read and compose sentences and made rapid progress. Valentin Huy was active in the political life of his time and was secretary of the National Constituent Assembly elections of 1792, then civil commissioner. After he stopped for lunch in a cafe on the Place de la Concorde, Paris, there he witnessed an ensemble of people from Quinze Hospice for the Blind being met during the religious street festival, Saint Ovid's Fair. They were given dance cups, oversized cardboard glasses, and told to play their instruments, which resulted in a cacophony of noises. He decided to found a school with Charles Michel de Lippe. In May 1784, at Saint Germain des Prés, he met a young beggar named Francois Lesueur. So dance is a mild insult in English meaning a person who is slow at learning or stupid. A dance cap, also variously known as the dance hat. Dance cap or dance hat is a pointed hat formerly used as an article of discipline in schools in Europe and the United States, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, for children who were disruptive or were considered slow in learning. Charles Barbier de la Serre. He was the inventor of several forms of shorthand and alternative means of writing. He explains that conventional writing is a barrier to universal literacy because it takes too long to learn, and people who must earn their living, like farmers artisans, cannot devote the necessary time to education. Barbier was also concerned about the barriers to literacy faced by people with visual or hearing impairments. Shorthand is an abbreviated symbolic writing method that increases speed and brevity of writing as compared to longhand, a more common method of writing a language. The process of writing in shorthand is called stenography, from the Greek word stenos, narrow, and graphein, to write, was the inventor of several forms of shorthand and alternative means of writing, one of which became the inspiration for Braille. Barbier wrote to the Institution Royale des Jeunes Aveugles, Royal Institution for Blind Youth, in Paris to tell them about his invention. The first director was not interested because the school had a tradition of using race type that he had invested in significantly. When that director left in 1821, Barbier wrote again, and the new director, a man called Alexandre René Pinier, as a student to learn the method and demonstrate it to the other students and to the members of the board of directors. Louis Braille. He was a French educator and the inventor of a reading and writing system named Braille after him, intended for use by visually impaired people. His system is used worldwide and remains virtually unchanged to this day. Braille was blinded at the age of 3 in one eye as a result of an accident with a stitching awl in his father's harness making shop. Consequently, an infection set in and spread to both eyes, resulting in total blindness. At that time, there were not many resources in place for the blind, but he nevertheless excelled in his education and received a scholarship to France's Royal Institute for Blind Youth. While still a student there, he began developing a system of tactile code that could allow blind people to read and write quickly and efficiently, inspired by a system invented by Charles Babbage. Braille's new method was more compact and lent itself to a range of uses, including music. He presented his work to his peers for the first time in 1824 when he was 15 years old. In adulthood, Braille served as a professor at the institute and had an avocation as a musician. But he largely spent the remainder of his life refining and extending his system. It went unused by most educators for many years after his death, but posterity has recognized Braille as a revolutionary invention and it has been adapted for use in languages worldwide. Timeline of events, persons, and ideas that shaped the early history of special and inclusive education. Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard. He is perhaps best known for his work with Victor of Aveyron. Jean-Marc Itard was known for his work on intellectual disability. A case he is well known for is that of Victor, the wild boy of Aveyron, a child reportedly found wandering naked in the woods and lived in the wild. He managed to teach Victor how to identify common objects, letters of the alphabet, and the meaning of some words. Itard was credited with describing the first case of Tourette's syndrome. Victor of Aveyron. He was a French feral child who was found at the age of around 9. Feral child means wild child, who is a young individual who has lived isolated from human contact from a very young age, with little or no experience of human care, social behavior, or language. Edward Seguin. He was a French physician and educationist born in Clamcy, Nevers. He is remembered for his work with children having cognitive impairments in France and the United States. Samuel Gridley Howe. He was an American physician, abolitionist, and advocate of education for the blind. Abolitionist means a movement to end slavery and liberate enslaved people around the world. In America, he met with supporters of the Polish Revolution and was chosen to take money to revolutionaries in Europe. Thus, he had two missions: to learn about schools for the blind, and as chairman of the American Polish Committee at Paris, to support the Polish revolutionaries. Returning to Boston in July 1832, Howe began receiving a few blind children at his father's house in Pleasant Street. He gradually developed what became the noted Perkins Institution. Colonel Thomas Handasid Perkins, a prominent Boston trader in slaves furs and opium, donated his mansion and grounds in Pearl Street as a location for the school in perpetuity. This building was later found unsuitable, and Colonel Perkins agreed to its sale. In 1839, the institution was moved to the former Mount Washington House Hotel in South Boston. It was known as the Perkins Institution and Massachusetts Asylum since 1877, a school for the blind. Working with Dorothea Dix, Howe also helped establish the Massachusetts School for Idiot and Feeble-Minded Youth. The Western Hemisphere's oldest publicly funded institution serving mentally disabled people. He founded the school in 1848 with a $2,500 appropriation from the Massachusetts legislature. Howe was successful in his attempt to educate mentally disabled people, but this led to other problems. Some commentators argued that those with disabilities did so well in schools such as Howe's that they should permanently reside there. Howe was opposed to this reasoning, arguing that mentally disabled people had rights and that segregating them from the rest of society would be detrimental. Howe's plan was based on the theories of the French philosopher Denis Diderot, who believed the sense of touch could develop its own medium of symbolic language. John Dix Fisher, he was a physician and founder of Perkins Institution for the Blind in Boston, Massachusetts. Through his friend Dr. Jan Dix Fisher, a Boston physician who had started a movement there as early as 1826 to establish a school for the blind. He had learned of a similar school founded in Paris by Valentin Huy. Perkins School for the Blind. It was named after Thomas Handacid Perkins, home of Laura Bridgman and Helen Keller, founded in 1829. Perkins was the first school for the blind established in the United States. The school was originally named the New England Asylum for the Blind and was incorporated on March 2, 1829. The name was eventually changed to Perkins School for the Blind. John Dix Fisher first considered the idea of a school for blind children based upon his visits to Paris at the National Institute for the Blind and was inspired to create such a school in Boston. But it was founded by Samuel Gridley Howe, who had also studied education for the blind in Europe. Laura Dewey Lynn Bridgman, the first known deafblind person to be successfully educated in the United States, Bridgman was left deafblind at the age of 2 after contracting scarlet fever. Scarlet fever, also known as scarlatina, is an infectious disease caused by Streptococcus pyogenes, a group A. Streptococcus most commonly affects children between 5 and 15 years of age. The signs and symptoms include sore throat fever, headache, swollen lymph nodes, and a characteristic rash. The face is flushed and the rash is red and blanching. It typically feels like sandpaper and the tongue may be red and bumpy. Her family was struck with scarlet fever when Laura was 2 years old. The illness killed her two older sisters and left her deafblind and without a sense of smell or taste. Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan. Deaf Anne, at the age of 5, Sullivan contracted trachoma, an eye disease which left her partially blind and without reading or writing skills. Deaf-blind Helen Adams Keller, was an American author, disability rights advocate, political activist, and lecturer. At 19 months old, Keller contracted an unknown illness described by doctors such as an acute congestion of the stomach and brain meningitis. Maria Montessori, founder of the Montessori method of education. She was an Italian physician and educator best known for the philosophy of education that bears her name and her writing on scientific pedagogy. The Maria Montessori theory is an educational approach that emphasizes individualized instruction and self-paced learning. It is based on the belief that children are naturally curious and capable of learning independently. University of Rome work as a voluntary assistant. Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard and Edward Seguin influenced her work. In 1900, the National League opened the Scuola Magistrale Ortophonica or Orthophrenic School, a medico-pedagogical institute for training teachers in educating children with learning difficulties with an attached laboratory classroom. Montessori was appointed co-director. They used special methods of instruction. During her 2 years at the school, Montessori developed methods and materials which she later adapted to use with mainstream children. The school was an immediate success. The children in the model classroom were drawn from the asylum and ordinary schools but considered uneducable due to their deficiencies. Some of these children later passed public examinations given to the so-called normal children. The first Casa or Casa dei Bambini Children's House in 1906, Montessori was invited to oversee the care and education of a group of children of working parents in a new apartment building for low-income families in San Lorenzo district in Rome. Montessori was interested in applying her work and methods to children without mental disabilities, and she accepted. Given a free choice of activity, children showed more interest in practical activities. She felt by working independently, children could reach new levels of autonomy and become self motivated to reach new levels of understanding. Montessori also came to believe that acknowledging all children as individuals and treating them as such would yield better learning and fulfilled potential in each particular child. The children in her programs continued to exhibit concentration, attention, and spontaneous self-discipline. Around 1920, the Catalan independence movement began to demand that Montessori take a political stand and make a public statement favoring Catalan independence, and she refused. Benito Mussolini's fascist government came to power in Italy. She expressed that establishing lasting peace is the work of education. All politics can do is keep us out of war. Association Montessori International, Forgotten Citizen or Neglected Citizen, which children has no rights. Montessori method of education. Traditional Montessori educational materials on display at the exhibition designed for children at Trinel de Milano, Milan. The Montessori method of education is a type of educational method that involves children's natural interests and activities rather than formal teaching methods. A Montessori classroom places an emphasis on hands-on learning and developing real-world skills. It emphasizes independence and it views children as naturally eager for knowledge and capable of initiating learning in a sufficiently supportive and well-prepared learning environment. It discourages some conventional measures of achievement, such as grades and tests. This is a method of education for young children that stresses the development of child's own initiative and new natural abilities, especially through practical play. This method allowed children to develop at their own pace and provided educators with a new understanding of child development. The students learn through activities that involve exploration, manipulations, order, repetition, abstraction, and communication. Teachers encourage children in the first two age groups to use their senses to explore and manipulate materials in their immediate environment. Children in the last age group deal with abstract concepts based on their newly developed powers of reasoning, imagination, and creativity. Montessori method of education. So this method takes a child-centered approach to learning. Each lesson and activity in our classrooms revolves around each student's unique interests and abilities. Grace Maxwell Fernald. She was an educational psychologist and influential figure in early 20th century literacy in education. Fernald established the first clinic for remedial instruction in 1921 at the University of California, Los Angeles. Herbert Goddard. He was a prominent American psychologist, eugenicist, and segregationist during the early 20th century. He is known especially for his 1912 work, The Kallikak Family, a study in the heredity of feeble-mindedness. He was the main advocate for the use of intelligence testing in societal institutions, including hospitals, schools, the legal system, and the military. In 1911, helped to write the first U.S. law requiring the blind, deaf, and intellectually disabled children be provided special education within public school systems. He helped develop the new topic of clinical psychology. in 1911 helped to write the first U.S. law requiring the blind, deaf, and intellectually disabled children be provided special education within public school systems, and in 1914 became the first American psychologist to testify in court that subnormal intelligence should limit the criminal responsibility of defendants. Moron, imbecile, and idiot. Goddard was a strong advocate of eugenics, although he believed that feeble-minded people bearing children was inadvisable. He hesitated to promote compulsory sterilization, even though he was convinced that it would eliminate intellectual disability. Because he did not think such a plan could gain widespread acceptance. Instead, he suggested that colonies should be established where the feeble-minded could be segregated. The Kallikak Family, a study in the heredity of feeble-mindedness, was a 1912 book by the American psychologist and eugenicist Henry Goddard. The name Kallikak is a pseudonym used as a family name throughout the book. Goddard coined the name from the Greek word kalos, meaning good, and kakos, meaning bad. Martin Kallikak Jr., the supposedly illegitimate offspring of Martin Kallikak Sr. and the barmaid, was in fact the son of Gabriel Wolverton and his wife, Catherine Murray. His real name was John Wolverton, and he was a landowner prosperous enough to buy 2 tracts of land for crash in 1809. The Kallikak family, a study in the heredity of feeble-mindedness. The name Kallikak is a pseudonym used as a Kallikak name throughout the book. Goddard coined the name from the Greek words kalos, meaning good, and kakos, meaning bad. Alfred Strauss. He presumed that children with learning disabilities who were not mentally retarded, hearing impaired, or emotionally disturbed had minimal brain damage. He developed a number of qualitative diagnostic measures of brain injury in children. Heinz Werner, he was a developmental psychologist who also studied perception, aesthetics, and language. One of his major contributions was the development of the organismic developmental theory, which emphasized the interplay between biological and environmental factors in shaping human development. Werner's ideas were influential in bridging the gap between biological and psychological perspectives on development. Werner's research encompassed various aspects of developmental psychology, including sensory and motor development, language acquisition, and the influence of culture on cognitive growth. He also explored the concept of functional autonomy, which refers to the idea that certain behaviors become independent of their original motivating factors as an individual develops. Additionally, Werner made contributions to understanding of abnormal psychology and psychopathology. He studied atypical development and examined how certain conditions or experiences could affect a person's psychological well-being. Samuel Alexander Kirk. He was an American psychologist and educator who is best known for coining the term learning disability. After his famous 1963 Learning Disability speech, he was appointed by President John F. Kennedy to the post of Director of the Office of Education's Division of Handicapped Children for 1963 and 1964. During this time, he convinced the government to provide money to train teachers of students with learning disabilities. Samuel Kirk is recognized for his accomplishments in the field of special education, while sometimes being referred to as the father of special education. In 1963, Kirk developed a speech to an education conference and was the first to use and define the term learning disability. This speech had a monumental effect on social policies and also helped name Kirk to the federal post by John F. Kennedy, who had a sister had a disability, now more commonly called an intellectual disability. Kirk laid the groundwork for passing laws which required schools to provide help for children with learning disabilities. In public policy, Kirk persuaded Washington to provide money in order to train teachers to help students with learning disabilities. Kirk's commitment to students with learning disabilities led to the first ever Institute for Research on Exceptional Children more than 50 years ago, which is still a popular foundation in the special education department. So this is John F. Kennedy, former US President, and his sister Rosemary Kennedy. So during Rosemary Kennedy's birth, the doctor was not immediately available because of an outbreak of the Spanish influenza epidemic, and the nurse ordered Rose Kennedy to keep her legs closed, forcing the baby's head to stay in the birth canal for 2 hours. The action resulted in a harmful loss of oxygen. As Rosemary began to grow, her parents noticed she was not reaching the basic developmental steps normally reaches at a certain month or year. At 2 years old, she had a hard time sitting up, crawling, and learning to walk. Marian Frostig, the founder and executive director of the Marian Frostig Center of Educational Therapy, USA. The Frostig Center was founded in 1951 by Marian Frostig, a pioneer in the study, diagnosis, and treatment of learning disabilities. The Frostig Center is dedicated to helping children with learning disabilities reach their full potential through an integrated approach of primary research, professional development, and consultation. And the Frostig School Testing as a Basis for Educational Therapy, Journal of Special Education. Frostig School is part of the Frostig Center, which is a non-profit organization dedicated to improving the lives of children with learning disabilities through research, professional development, and consultation and education. The Frostig Center has been a leader and expert in the field of learning differences since it was founded by Dr. Marian Frostig in 1951. The Frostig Center is also home to the Consultation and Education Department, which trains hundreds of public, private, and parochial school teachers every year to use research-based instructional strategies that improve learning for struggling students. Newell Carlisle Kephart. Kephart made major contributions to both the theory and practice of special education. His neurophysiological approach to the diagnosis and treatment of learning difficulties greatly influenced the thinking in the field, and his classroom applications, presented in a manner readily understood by teachers, have been widely employed throughout the United States since the Perceptua Motor Training movement of the 1960s, to which Kephart was a leading contributor. He taught a generation of teachers and that parents are major contributors to their child's development and that they must be involved in the child's education. William Cruikshank. He was the first educator of the Division of Special Education at Syracuse University's School of Education. He was a pioneer in the field of interdisciplinary special education and had immeasurable influence on the way in which the study of disabilities and education evolved. Timeline of history of special education in the Philippines. Delia Delight Rice, the first teacher of the deaf in the Philippines. She was a teacher and missionary pivotal in developing educational facilities in the Philippines in the early 20th century. While working in Ohio, she came across an issue of the Ohio Chronicle, which advertised a position as a teacher of the deaf in the Philippine Islands from the U.S. Civil Service Commission. In order to be considered for the position, applicants had to pass an exam. Out of all the applicants, she was the only one to pass and was given a 3-year contract. The Bureau of Health conducted a special census and reported that there were no deaf children on the islands. It turned out that the reason why deaf children were thought to be non-existent was due to the perceptions of them they were called desgraciadas, unfortunates, and the common belief was that they were sent as a direct punishment from God to the parents for their misconduct. In 1907, the Light established the Manila Institute for the Deaf and Dumb, now called the Philippine School for the Deaf. The school provided educational opportunities to both deaf and blind students, as well as religious instruction. The children were taught using a variety of techniques, including reading, writing, finger spelling, and speech to teach English. The school expanded in numbers and soon outgrew its location. Many of the students that graduated from the school went on to pursue education at the California School for the Deaf as well as Gallaudet College, now Gallaudet University. She was awarded an honorary doctorate in 1955 from Gallaudet University, and upon her return to the Philippines in 1961, she was honored with a historical marker and awarded a 6-week trip through Asia and Europe, visiting all of their s- deaf schools. The Philippine School for the Deaf, PSD, formerly known as the School for the Deaf and Blind, SDB. PSD's first class consists of a three pupils, two deaf and one blind, in a small rented house in Ermita, Manila. In 1923, the school moved to its present location along Harrison Boulevard, occupying a two-floor semi-concrete structure. In 1963, the School for the Deaf and Blind underwent a significant change when it was separated into two distinct institutions by virtue of Republic Act 3562, or an act to promote the education of the blind in the Philippines. The Philippine National School for the Blind, PNSB, was separated from PSD and became independent in 1970. And this is an important cultural property. The Philippine National School for the Blind. PSD's first class consists of a three pupils, two deaf and one blind, in a small rented house in Manila.